The church fell silent the moment her voice rang out. Not a whisper, not a breath. Just the echo of a 12-year-old girl's words bouncing off stained glass and wooden pews, freezing 200 guests mid-gasp. Amara stood in the center aisle, her small frame trembling in a dress 2 sizes too big, donated by a neighbor who pitied her. The fabric hung loose around her shoulders, the hem dragging on carpet that smelled like old hymns and furniture polish and decades of prayers whispered into silence. Her mother stood at the altar in white lace and fresh makeup, looking more beautiful than Amara had ever seen her. The dress must have cost more than 3 months of their rent back when they lived in the apartment with the broken heater and the landlord who never fixed anything, who ignored their calls and let them freeze through 2 winters. And beside her mother stood Marcus Bennett, the groom, a man whose smile had always been too wide, whose hands had always lingered too long on her mother's waist, on her shoulder, on the small of her back with a possessiveness that made Amara's skin crawl, whose eyes had always promised things Amara didn't yet have words for but understood in the way children understand danger before they can name it, in the way prey recognizes a predator even in the dark. "Don't marry him," Amara said again, louder this time, her voice cracking like ice breaking over a frozen lake. "Please, Mama." "Don't," her mother's face drained of color, all the careful foundation and blush suddenly looking garish against skin gone pale as paper. The pastor's Bible hung open in his hands, suspended mid-sentence, his mouth forming a word he would never finish, the blessed union hanging incomplete in the air. Marcus turned slowly, deliberately, like a predator who'd heard a sound in the brush and was calculating whether to pounce or to wait, his jaw tight. His eyes narrowing on the girl who had just shattered his moment, his perfect performance, the culmination of months of careful manipulation and strategic courtship. The guests leaned forward in their seats, some with phones already out, others clutching pearls and purses. Hungry for scandal the way people always are when it's someone else's life burning down in front of them, when they can watch tragedy unfold from a safe distance. A woman in the 3rd row, Mrs. Henderson from the neighborhood watch, whispered something sharp and judgmental to her husband. Her face twisted in that particular expression of disgust, reserved for children who don't know their place, who speak when they should be silent. A man near the back stood, as if preparing to intervene, but didn't move, didn't speak, didn't do anything except bear witness to a moment that would replay in his mind for years afterward. That would make him question every time he'd chosen silence over action. No one moved, they just watched, transfixed by the spectacle of a child's rebellion. Amara's chest heaved, her lungs struggling to pull in air that felt too thick, too heavy. Saturated with the smell of lilies and expensive perfume, and the sweat of 200 people packed into uncomfortable pews. She could feel every pair of eyes on her, could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders like physical hands trying to force her to her knees, to make her submit, to make her be good. She could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears, a drum beating out a rhythm of terror and determination in equal measure, each beat asking her if she was sure, if she was ready for what came next. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clench them into fists just to keep from collapsing, her nails digging crescents into her palms, creating small pains to anchor herself against the larger one. But she didn't look away. She stared straight at her mother, willing her to see, to listen, to remember who she used to be before Marcus came into their lives with his money and his charm and his promises that sounded like salvation, but tasted like poison before he'd slowly, methodically erased the woman she'd been and replaced her with someone smaller, quieter, more afraid. "Amara," her mother hissed, voice barely above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through skin and bone to draw blood without leaving visible marks. "Sit down, now." But Amara didn't sit. She couldn't, not after everything. Not after the nights she'd spent awake in her narrow bed with the thin mattress and the broken spring that dug into her back, listening through thin walls to sounds that made her stomach twist, to voices raised and then suddenly quiet in a way that was worse than shouting, in a way that meant something had been resolved through force rather than agreement. Not after the bruises she'd seen her mother try to hide with foundation and long sleeves even in summer heat, even when they couldn't afford to run the air conditioning and the apartment was stifling. Not after the way Marcus looked at her when her mother wasn't watching, like she was something he could break if he wanted to. Like she was an inconvenience he was counting the days until he could remove. Like she was an obstacle between him and complete ownership of her mother. Not after she'd watched her mother shrink, week by week, month by month, becoming smaller and quieter and more afraid until she was barely recognizable as the woman who used to sing while doing dishes, who used to laugh at bad jokes, who used to be strong enough to leave Amara's father when he got too mean, who used to tell Amara that no man was worth losing yourself for. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could, Marcus stepped forward. His smile was gone now, dropped like a mask that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. His face was stone, all hard angles and cold calculation, the face of a man conducting business rather than getting married. He descended the altar steps slowly, deliberately, each footfall measured and precise, his polished Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. Like the ticking of a clock in an empty room. The sound was deafening in the silence, each click another second closer to something terrible, another moment of tension stretching tighter and tighter. He stopped 3 feet from Amara, looming over her, 6 feet 2 inches of tailored suit and barely contained rage, his shadow swallowing her whole. Blocking out the light from the stained glass windows that painted the floor in reds and blues and golds, in colors that suddenly seemed garish and false. "This is a sacred moment," he said quietly, his voice smooth and controlled, modulated to perfection, the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed, who'd spent years in boardrooms bending people to his will with nothing but tone and presence. "You're upset, I understand. Change is hard for children. But you need to go sit down and let your mother be happy." The word happy hung in the air like a lie so obvious even the walls seemed to reject it. Even the angels painted on the ceiling seemed to turn away. Amara's throat tightened, muscles constricting around words that needed to come out but wouldn't, couldn't, not with him standing there radiating menace disguised as concern. Not with him using that voice that made reasonable things sound threatening. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run. But her feet were rooted to the floor, and her voice was trapped somewhere deep inside her chest, suffocating under the weight of his stare. Under the pressure of 200 people waiting to see if she would break, if she would be good, if she would submit to the will of adults who knew better. Her mother appeared beside Marcus, her face twisted in a mix of embarrassment and desperation, mascara already starting to run at the corners of her eyes, creating dark tracks through her foundation. "Amara, baby, please," she whispered, reaching out but not quite touching her daughter, her hand hovering in the space between them like she was afraid of what contact might mean. What it might unleash, what it might force her to acknowledge. "We'll talk about this later, I promise. But right now you need to. He hurts you." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward, touching every person in every pew, impossible to ignore. Impossible to take back, impossible to pretend hadn't been spoken. Her mother froze, her hand still extended, her face caught between emotions too complex to name, too tangled to separate into individual threads. Marcus's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath his skin, his carefully constructed composure cracking at the edges like paint on an old wall. The guests erupted into murmurs, a low rumble that filled the church like distant thunder, building and building until it was almost a roar. Voices overlapping in shock and speculation and vicarious thrill. Amara's voice shook, her whole body shook, but she forced herself to keep going, forced the words out past the terror. Past the part of her that wanted to take it all back and be good and make everyone comfortable again. "He hurts you, Mama, I've seen it, I've heard it, and you keep pretending like it's okay, but it's not okay. And I can't just sit here and watch you promise yourself to him forever when I know what forever means. When I know what happens behind closed doors." Her mother's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't tears of gratitude or relief. They weren't the tears of a woman being saved from drowning. They were tears of anger, of humiliation, of a woman whose dirty laundry was being aired in front of everyone she knew, everyone she'd been trying so hard to impress. Everyone she'd told that Marcus was wonderful, that she was lucky, that everything was perfect, that her daughter was just having trouble adjusting. She grabbed Amara's arm, her grip too tight, her perfectly manicured nails digging into skin hard enough to leave marks, hard enough to bruise. "That's enough," she said through gritted teeth, her voice low and dangerous, vibrating with barely suppressed rage. "You don't know what you're talking about. You're a child. You don't understand." But Amara pulled away, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over the hem of her too-long dress, her voice rising even as her confidence wavered. "I know what I saw. I know what he did to you last Tuesday when he thought I was asleep. I know about the hospital visit you lied about, told me you had the flu when you came home with your wrist in a splint. I know about the phone calls you make to Grandma when you're crying and then hang up before you say anything. I know." Marcus moved fast. Too fast for a man his size, with an efficiency that spoke of practice. His hand shot out and gripped Amara's shoulder, his fingers pressing into bone, finding pressure points with the precision of someone who'd done this before, who knew exactly how much force to apply to cause pain without leaving visible marks, without giving evidence that would last. His face was calm, perfectly controlled, but his eyes were ice, glacial and merciless, the eyes of something that had never been human or had forgotten how. He leaned down so only she could hear, his breath hot against her ear, smelling of mint and something else, something darker. "You're making a scene," he said softly, each word carefully enunciated, each syllable a threat. "And if you don't stop right now, you're going to regret it. Your mother is going to regret it. Do you understand me? I can make things very difficult for both of you, very difficult. There are ways to hurt people that don't leave marks. There are ways to destroy lives that look perfectly legal. Do you understand?" Amara's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at him, at the man her mother was about to bind herself to forever in sickness and in health, till death do them part, and she saw it clearly for the first time. Stripped of all pretense and performance. The truth behind the mask, the monster wearing expensive cologne and $1,000 suit. The predator who'd been circling her mother for months, isolating her from friends, from family, from anyone who might help her see clearly. And in that moment, she realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in her veins that no one was going to save her mother. No one was going to stop this. Not the pastor, who was already looking away, uncomfortable with conflict, more invested in the ceremony than the marriage. Not the guests, who were more interested in gossip than intervention, who would talk about this for months but do nothing. Not even her mother herself, who'd been broken down so systematically, so completely, so skillfully that she couldn't see the prison she was walking into. Couldn't see that the key was being turned even as she walked down the aisle. So she did the only thing she could think of, the thing she'd been planning for 3 days, ever since she'd made her decision. Ever since she'd found the evidence hidden in her mother's dresser, and known that words alone wouldn't be enough, that she needed proof, needed something undeniable. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was small, wrinkled, stained with something dark at the edges that might have been coffee or might have been blood. She'd never asked. Her hands shook as she unfolded it, and for a moment she thought she might faint, thought her legs might give out and she'd collapse right there on the carpet in front of everyone. Become exactly the hysterical child they all thought she was. But then she looked at her mother's face, at the tears streaming down her cheeks, at the way she was shrinking under Marcus's presence, making herself smaller, trying to disappear. And she found her voice again, found strength in reserves she didn't know existed. "This is a police report," Amara said, her voice steadier now, drawing strength from some deep well she hadn't known she possessed. "From 3 months ago, March 15th. When Mama went to the emergency room at 2 in the morning and told them she fell down the stairs. The church went silent again, deathly silent. The kind of silence that comes before an explosion, before the world changes irrevocably. Amara held up the paper, her hands still trembling but her grip firm, her resolve hardening with every second. But she didn't fall, he pushed her. During an argument about me, about whether I should be allowed to go to my friend's birthday party, she said yes, he said no. She stood her ground. And he pushed her down a full flight of stairs. Marcus's grip on her shoulder tightened, his fingers digging in so hard she knew there would be bruises. Knew she'd wear the marks of this moment on her skin for weeks, knew that in some way she'd carry them forever. Her mother gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like something breaking, reaching for the paper with shaking hands, her face a mask of horror and shame, but Amara pulled it back. Held it away, held it high. I found it in her dresser, Amara continued, her voice cracking but not stopping, couldn't stop now, not when she'd come this far, not when she'd already burned every bridge. She filed a report, but then she dropped it, because he convinced her no one would believe her, because he told her she needed him, because he made her think she was nothing without him. Because he said if she went through with it, he'd make sure she lost everything, including me. He said he had lawyers, connections, that he could prove she was an unfit mother, that he could take me away and she'd never see me again. That's a lie, Marcus said coldly. But his voice had lost its smoothness, the practiced warmth replaced with something raw and dangerous, something that confirmed everything Amara was saying simply by existing. You're a child, you don't understand adult relationships. You're confused, you're acting out because you're jealous of the attention your mother is giving me, I'm 12, Amara interrupted, her eyes blazing with something fierce and unbreakable. Something that had been forged in months of watching her mother suffer. But I'm not stupid, and I'm not confused. I know what I heard when you told Mama that accidents happen to people who talk too much. I know what I saw when you grabbed her throat at dinner last month and smiled while you did it, smiled like you enjoyed it. I know what it means when she flinches every time you raise your hand, even if you're just reaching for something. I know what it means when she apologizes for things that aren't her fault, when she makes herself smaller, when she stops singing. Her mother was sobbing now. Full-body sobs that shook her shoulders and made her veil slip sideways, ruining the perfect bridal picture she'd worked so hard to create, spent so many hours on, invested so much hope in. She reached for Amara, but the girl stepped back, holding the paper high for everyone to see, turning slowly so every person in every pew could witness it, could see the official letterhead, could see the truth documented in black and white. There's a doctor's note too, Amara said, her voice carrying to the back of the church, to every corner, to every person who'd come here expecting romance. And pictures, she kept them all. I don't know why, maybe she thought she'd need them one day, maybe she thought someone would finally listen. Maybe she was just too scared to throw them away, because keeping them was the only way she could hold on to the truth when he kept telling her she was crazy, that she was imagining things, that she was the problem, that she was too sensitive, too emotional, too everything. A man in the back stood up. He was older, maybe 50, with gray threading through dark hair, dressed in a dark suit that looked government issue, his face unreadable, weathered in a way that suggested he'd seen things that would keep most people awake at night, things that had carved lines around his eyes and mouth. Amara didn't recognize him. She'd never seen him before in her life. Her mother hadn't mentioned inviting anyone she didn't know. But he walked down the aisle with purpose, his shoes echoing in the silence, each step deliberate, and when he reached the front, he extended his hand toward her. His expression gentle despite the hardness in his eyes, despite the way he looked at Marcus like he was cataloging evidence. "May I see that?" he asked quietly, his voice respectful, treating her like a person, not a child throwing a tantrum, not an inconvenience to be managed. Amara hesitated, looking at her mother, then at Marcus, then at this stranger who seemed to materialize from nowhere like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to pray. Something in his face made her trust him, some quality she couldn't name but recognized instinctively, the way you recognize safety when you've been living in danger. She handed him the paper. The man unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the document, taking in every detail, every typed line, every official stamp. Every piece of evidence that Amara's mother had collected and then tried to forget. His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes, something cold and final, the look of someone making a decision that couldn't be unmade. A decision that would alter the course of multiple lives. He looked at Marcus, a long, assessing look that took in the expensive suit, the perfectly styled hair, the fury barely contained behind the mask of respectability. Then at Amara's mother, seeing past the wedding dress to the woman underneath, the woman trying to hold herself together with shaking hands. Then at the pastor who was still standing at the altar looking like he wished the floor would open up and swallow him, wished he'd called in sick, wished he'd never agreed to perform this ceremony. "This wedding is over," he said simply. his voice carrying an authority that left no room for argument, no space for negotiation. Marcus laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling and came back wrong, distorted. "And who the hell are you?" The man reached into his jacket with practiced ease and pulled out a badge, letting it catch the light streaming through the stained glass. Letting everyone see the official seal. "Detective Raymond Cole, I've been investigating Marcus Bennett for the past 6 months. Assault, harassment, fraud, coercion, witness intimidation. And now, thanks to this brave young woman, I have enough to make an arrest that will actually stick." The church erupted. Guests stood, phones out, recording now, voices overlapping in a chaotic wave of shock and disbelief and vindication and horror and excitement. Marcus's face went white, all the blood draining away, leaving him looking almost skeletal, leaving him looking like what he was underneath all the charm. He took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture that was meant to look innocent but came across as defensive, his voice rising with a desperation that was almost convincing. That probably would have been convincing 6 months ago before people knew to look closer. "This is insane. You can't, this is my wedding. You can't just, I have rights. You can't do this without a warrant. This is harassment. I'll have your badge." I can," Detective Cole said calmly, unmoved by the outburst, unmoved by the threats he'd probably heard 1,000 times before from 1,000 men just like Marcus. "And I am. I have a warrant, I have evidence, I have testimony from multiple witnesses, and now I have this." He held up the police report. "Marcus Bennett, you're under arrest for assault, battery, witness intimidation, and coercion. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." 2 uniformed officers appeared from the back of the church where they'd been waiting, where they'd positioned themselves before the ceremony even started. Moving swiftly down the aisle, their footsteps synchronized, professional. Marcus turned to run, but there was nowhere to go, no exit that wasn't blocked, no way out of the trap he'd walked into thinking he was invincible. Thinking his money and his connections made him untouchable. They grabbed him, their movements efficient and professional, trained, cuffing his wrists behind his back as he shouted, his voice desperate now, all pretense gone. All charm evaporated like morning dew. "This is a mistake. She's lying. They're all lying. You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? Do you know how much money I have? Do you know who my lawyers are? I'll have your badge. I'll have your job. I'll have this entire department. But no one was listening anymore. The officers read him his rights while Marcus struggled, his expensive suit jacket tearing at the shoulder, his carefully styled hair falling into his face. His perfect image fracturing with every second. Amara watched, frozen, as they dragged him down the aisle, past pews full of people who'd come expecting romance and were getting reality instead, getting truth in its rawest form. Some guests were crying, others were filming, phones held high to capture every moment. A few looked satisfied, like they'd suspected all along but never said anything, comfortable in their silence until someone else broke it, until a child showed them what courage looked like. Marcus's shouts faded as they pushed him through the church doors into the afternoon sunlight, and then there was only the sound of Amara's mother sobbing, collapsed onto the steps of the altar. Her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking so hard the lace on her dress trembled, her carefully constructed world falling apart in real time. The guests slowly began to file out, murmuring, whispering, casting glances at the girl who had just destroyed a wedding and saved a life in the same breath. Some looked at her with pity, others with admiration, a few with something like fear, as if courage might be contagious, as if seeing a child speak truth might inspire them to examine their own silences, their own complicity, their own moments when they chose comfort over intervention. Detective Cole knelt in front of Amara, his face soft now, his voice gentle in a way that suggested he had children of his own, that he understood what this moment cost her. "You did the right thing," he said, and his eyes held nothing but respect, nothing but recognition of what she'd sacrificed. "Do you understand that? What you did here took more courage than most people show in their entire lives. You saved your mother. You potentially saved other women he would have hurt in the future. You broke a cycle. That matters, that will always matter." Amara nodded, but she didn't feel brave. She felt hollow, scooped out. like everything inside her had been poured onto the church floor, and she was standing in the shell of who she used to be, trying to figure out what came next. Who she would become now. Detective Cole stood and walked over to her mother, speaking to her in low tones that Amira couldn't hear over the sound of her own heartbeat, her own breathing. She saw him hand her mother a card, saw him put a hand on her shoulder with the kind of gentleness that suggested he'd done this before. That he'd stood in churches and living rooms and hospital corridors telling women they were safe now, that the nightmare was over. Her mother nodded, wiped her face, smearing mascara across her cheeks, looked up at her daughter with an expression Amara couldn't quite read. Was it gratitude, shame, anger, relief, love, terror? All of them at once, tangled together into something too complex for a single word, too big for easy categorization. The next hours blurred together like watercolors in rain. Statements given in a small room adjacent to the church. Questions answered, some multiple times. People from victim services arriving with kind eyes and gentle voices, and pamphlets about resources and healing. Her mother sitting in a pew, still in her wedding dress, mascara streaked down her face like war paint, staring at nothing or maybe at everything. At the future that had just opened up in front of her, terrifying in its possibility. Amara sitting beside her, close but not touching, both of them surrounded by the wreckage of what was supposed to be the happiest day of her mother's life. Both of them trying to process what had just happened, what it meant, where they went from here. When the sun began to set, painting the stained glass windows in shades of orange and purple and deep crimson, Amara found herself alone on the church steps. Her mother was inside, talking to someone official-looking about next steps, about restraining orders, about resources, about all the practical things that had to happen now, that the immediate crisis was over. Detective Cole had left an hour ago, promising to follow up, promising they were safe, that Marcus wouldn't make bail, that they had time to breathe, time to figure things out, time to heal. The world felt quiet now, too quiet, like the aftermath of a storm when everything is still, and you're not sure if it's over or if you're just in the eye of it, waiting for the other half to hit. Waiting for consequences you can't predict. A car pulled up to the curb, something modest and practical, a Honda or a Toyota, not the kind of car that announced itself. A woman stepped out. She was young, maybe 30, with dark skin and kind eyes and hair pulled back in a simple bun. She wore slacks and a blazer, professional but approachable, the kind of clothes that suggested competence without intimidation. She walked up the steps and sat beside Amara without asking permission, not saying anything at first, just sitting in the silence, letting it be, understanding that sometimes silence is what's needed. That sometimes the best thing you can offer is just presence. "My name is Dr. Iris M. Bain," the woman said eventually, her voice low and warm, with an accent that suggested she'd grown up somewhere else, somewhere far from here. "I'm a therapist. Detective Cole called me. He thought you and your mother might need someone to talk to." Amara didn't respond, didn't even look at her, just kept staring at the street where evening shadows were growing longer, where normal life continued despite everything that had happened. "You don't have to talk now," Dr. M. Bain continued, gazing out at the street with her, matching her silence. "But I want you to know something, what you did today. Most adults couldn't do what you did. You stood up when everyone else was silent. You told the truth when it was the hardest thing in the world to do. You chose your mother's safety over your own comfort, over social acceptability, over everything that tells children to be quiet and obedient. And you saved your mother's life." Amara's eyes burned. She bit her lip, trying to hold back the tears that had been building all day. But they came anyway, hot and fast, spilling down her cheeks and dripping onto the stone steps, leaving dark marks that would fade, but that she would remember. "I ruined her wedding," she whispered, her voice small and broken, the voice of a child who just destroyed everything familiar. "No, doctor," M. Bain said firmly, with absolute certainty, with a conviction that left no room for doubt. "You stopped a tragedy. There's a difference, a big one. Your mother wasn't walking toward happiness. She was walking toward years, maybe decades, of escalating abuse. You stopped that. You gave her a chance at a real future, not the prison Marcus was building for her." Amara looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something in the woman's face that made her think maybe. "Maybe, doctor." M'Bain understood in a way that went beyond professional training. Maybe she'd seen this before. Maybe she'd lived it. "Did someone save you?" Amara asked, the question coming out before she could stop it, before she could remember that asking personal questions of adults was rude. "Doctor." M'Bain was quiet for a moment, her face thoughtful, then nodded slowly. "My little sister, she was 10. I was 22 and thought I was in love, thought I knew what I was doing, thought I could handle it, thought it would get better. She knew better than I did. Took her a month to convince me to leave, but she never gave up. Never stopped telling me the truth even when I didn't want to hear it, even when I yelled at her, even when I told her to mind her own business." She paused, her eyes distant. "She saved my life. Just like you saved your mother's. And I spent years being angry at her for it, for making me face reality, before I finally understood what a gift she'd given me." Amara let herself cry then, not the silent, choking kind of tears she'd been holding back all morning, but real, gut-wrenching sobs that shook her whole body, released something that had been locked inside her for months, maybe years. Dr. M'Bain put an arm around her, holding her as she cried, not saying anything, not trying to make it better with empty words or false promises, just being there, solid and present and safe. When Amara finally stopped, her eyes swollen and her throat raw, her mother appeared in the doorway. She'd taken off the veil and the white heels, standing there in her wedding dress and bare feet, looking smaller somehow, more fragile, more human. Without the makeup, without the performance, without the illusion of happiness she'd been clinging to with both hands, she looked young and scared and lost. She walked over slowly, her eyes red and swollen, moving like someone who wasn't sure if they'd be welcomed or rejected, and knelt in front of her daughter, taking her hands in her own. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking on every syllable, fracturing like glass. "I'm so sorry, baby. You shouldn't have had to do that. You shouldn't have had to be the strong one. You shouldn't have had to save me. I'm the mother. I'm supposed to protect you, and instead—" She broke off, fresh tears flowing, running down her face and dripping onto their joined hands. "I let him into our lives. I let him hurt me. I let you see it. I let you carry this burden. I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry." Amara didn't know what to say. There were no words big enough for this moment, for everything that had happened and everything that would come next, for the years of healing that stretched ahead of them like an unknown country. So she just nodded, squeezed her mother's hands, held on. Her mother pulled her into a hug, and they stayed like that for a long time. Two broken people holding each other together in the dim light of a church that had almost witnessed the worst mistake of their lives. Clinging to each other like drowning swimmers who'd finally found solid ground, like survivors of a shipwreck floating in the same debris. In the weeks that followed, Marcus Bennett was formally charged with multiple counts of assault, battery, witness intimidation, and coercion. The evidence Amara had found, combined with Detective Cole's 6-month investigation that had been building quietly in the background, painted a clear picture of a man who had terrorized multiple women over the course of a decade, using his wealth and influence and carefully cultivated reputation to silence them, to make them doubt themselves, to trap them in cycles of abuse that seemed impossible to escape. Amara's mother testified, her voice shaking but clear, standing in a courtroom and telling the truth for the first time. So did 3 other women who came forward once they heard about the arrest, women who'd been carrying their stories in silence, waiting for someone to believe them, waiting for proof that speaking up wouldn't destroy them. The trial was long and brutal, stretching across months. Defense attorneys tried to paint the women as opportunistic, as unreliable, as vindictive exes conspiring against a successful man. They tried to make Amara's mother seem unstable, questioned her parenting, suggested she'd manipulated her daughter into lying, suggested the whole thing was a scheme for money. They put character witnesses on the stand who talked about Marcus's charity work, his business success, his reputation in the community. Amara sat in the courtroom every day she was allowed to, watching lawyers try to dismantle truth with technicalities, watching them try to make violence look like misunderstanding, watching them try to make fear look like fabrication. But the evidence was too strong, too documented, too real. Medical records, police reports, photographs, text messages, emails. A paper trail that Marcus had been too arrogant to fully erase, too confident in his own invincibility to properly cover. And testimony, not just from victims, but from neighbors who'd heard things, from hospital staff who'd seen things, from people who'd been too afraid to speak up before but found courage in numbers. In the end, Marcus was convicted on multiple counts. 15 years, the judge said, looking at him over reading glasses with an expression of pure disgust, with contempt for someone who'd used power to harm rather than help. 15 years for the documented abuse, for the threats, for the systematic destruction of women who'd made the mistake of trusting him, of believing his promises, of thinking his charm was real. Amara watched as they led him away in handcuffs for the final time, surrounded by guards, his expensive suit replaced with prison orange. He didn't look at her, didn't look at her mother, didn't look at any of the women he'd hurt. Just stared straight ahead, his face blank, as if he could erase them all by refusing to acknowledge their existence, as if he could maintain his sense of superiority even in defeat. Her mother started therapy, real therapy, twice-a-week sessions with Dr. Bain, where she unpacked years of trauma, learned to recognize the patterns that had led her to Marcus, learned to see the red flags she'd ignored or rationalized, learned to rebuild the sense of self he'd systematically destroyed brick by brick. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, days when she couldn't get out of bed, nights when she woke up screaming from nightmares where Marcus came back, where the trial had gone differently, where Amara hadn't been brave enough. But slowly, week by week, month by month, she started to come back. Not to who she'd been before Marcus. That person was gone, lost to time and trauma, but to someone new, someone stronger, someone who'd walked through fire and survived. Someone who knew her own worth now, in a way she never had before. She got a job at a local community center, helping other women who'd survived abuse, using her story to help them find their own courage, to help them see that leaving was possible. That life after abuse was real. She smiled more. She laughed sometimes, real laughter that reached her eyes and made them crinkle at the corners. She started singing again while doing dishes, old songs she'd forgotten she knew. She wasn't the same person she'd been before Marcus, but she was better than the person she'd become during those months with him. And she made sure Amara knew every single day that she was loved, that she was brave, that she was enough, that she'd saved not just her mother's life but her own future. Amara went back to school. It was strange at first, trying to be normal after everything that had happened. Trying to care about homework and tests and social drama, when she'd just lived through something that most people only saw in movies. The story had been in the news, local first and then picked up nationally when someone realized the human interest angle. Brave 12-year-old stops wedding to save mother from abuser. Her face had been blurred in the broadcasts, her name changed to protect her privacy. But word had spread the way it always does in small towns, through whispers and rumors and people who knew people. Her classmates looked at her differently now, some with respect like she'd done something heroic, some with pity like she was damaged, broken, something to be handled carefully. Some with curiosity, wanting details, wanting the story, wanting to touch tragedy from a safe distance. Some avoided her entirely, as if trauma might be catching, as if association might contaminate them. But Amara didn't care what they thought. She'd learned something that day in the church, something fundamental that had changed the architecture of who she was, that had restructured her understanding of the world. She'd learned that silence protects the wrong people. That being polite, being quiet, being obedient, those things only mattered when the system was working, when the adults were doing their jobs, when justice happened naturally. But when the system failed, when the adults looked away, when injustice dressed itself up in expensive suits and charming smiles and wedding ceremonies, someone had to speak. And if that someone had to be a 12-year-old girl, then so be it. Years passed. Amara grew up. She went to high school where she joined the debate team and learned to argue, learned to present evidence, learned to persuade. She studied hard, maintained perfect grades, driven by something she couldn't quite name but felt in her bones, a sense of purpose that had been born that day in the church. She went to college on a full scholarship funded by a women's advocacy organization that had heard her story and wanted to invest in her future. She studied law, spent her summers interning at domestic violence organizations, learning the systems that were supposed to protect people like her mother, but so often failed. learning about the gaps and the loopholes, and the ways that power could be weaponized even within institutions meant to provide justice. She learned about mandatory minimums and restraining orders, about the burden of proof and the credibility of victims, about how many women fell through cracks that shouldn't exist, that were built into the system through decades of decisions made by people who'd never experienced what it meant to be afraid in your own home. She learned about the economics of abuse, about how financial control trapped people as effectively as any lock. She learned about the psychology of it, about trauma bonds and learned helplessness, and why leaving was so much harder than it looked from the outside. She graduated top of her class, gave a speech at commencement about courage and truth that made her mother cry proud tears in the audience. She went to law school on another scholarship, excelled there too, became known among her professors as someone with unusual empathy combined with sharp analytical skills. Someone who could see both the human cost and the legal strategy, someone who understood that justice was about more than winning cases. She became the kind of woman who stood up in courtrooms and fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. She specialized in domestic violence cases, representing survivors pro bono when she could, taking on cases that other lawyers avoided because they were too complicated, too emotional, too likely to lose. She worked to change laws that failed to protect the vulnerable, testifying before legislative committees, writing briefs, building coalitions. She became known as fierce, uncompromising, the kind of lawyer who didn't back down from powerful defendants, who didn't settle for plea deals that let abusers walk free, who fought for accountability even when it was inconvenient, even when it was expensive, even when it made her unpopular. And sometimes, late at night when she was preparing for trial, surrounded by files and evidence and the accumulated stories of other people's trauma, she would think back to that day in the church. She would remember the way her hands shook as she held up that piece of paper. She would remember the way her mother cried. She would remember the way Marcus's face twisted when the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the moment when he realized his power had limits after all. That money and charm couldn't buy him out of everything. She would remember the fear and the courage and the terrible, wonderful moment when she chose truth over comfort. And she would know, without a doubt, that she'd done the right thing. Because sometimes, stopping a wedding isn't about ruining happiness. Sometimes, it's about preventing a lifetime of pain, about saving someone from a prison they don't even realize they're in, about speaking truth when everyone else has chosen comfortable silence. Chosen to look away, chosen to believe the pretty lies because they're easier than ugly truth. Sometimes, it's about being willing to be the villain in someone else's story, if it means being the hero in the story that actually matters, in the story of someone's life, in the story of their survival. And sometimes, it takes a child to see what every adult in the room refuses to acknowledge, because children haven't yet learned that some things are supposed to be ignored, that some secrets are supposed to be kept, that some people are too powerful to challenge, that rocking the boat is worse than drowning quietly. Her mother came to her law school graduation, sitting in the front row, crying proud tears, wearing a dress she'd picked out herself. Bright and colorful, and nothing like the muted colors Marcus had preferred. They had dinner afterward, just the two of them, at a small Italian restaurant where they could talk without being interrupted, where they could celebrate without performance. Her mother looked good, healthy, her eyes clear and bright in a way they hadn't been during those dark months with Marcus, in a way that suggested healing was real even when it was slow. "Do you ever regret it?" her mother asked quietly over coffee and tiramisu. "That day, what you did? The way everything changed?" Amara thought about it, really thought about it, turning the question over in her mind. About the fear and the shame and the way it had felt to stand in front of all those people and tear apart the illusion her mother had been desperately trying to maintain. About the hard years that followed, the therapy for both of them, the nightmares, the slow process of healing that was never linear, that involved setbacks and breakthroughs in equal measure. About the weight she'd carried, the responsibility she'd taken on at an age when she should have been worrying about school dances and friend drama. "No," she said finally, meeting her mother's eyes. "Never, not once, not even on the hardest days." Her mother reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it, her eyes filling with tears that she didn't try to hide. You saved my life, she said, not for the first time, but it landed differently now, with years of healing and growth behind them, with perspective that only time could provide. You were just a baby and you saved my life. You saw what I couldn't see. You were brave when I couldn't be. Her voice broke. You gave me a future. You would have figured it out eventually, Amara said, but even as she said it, she wasn't sure it was true. Her mother shook her head slowly, decisively. No, I wouldn't have. I was already gone, already convinced that I deserved it, that I couldn't survive without him, that his version of love was the best I could hope for. Another few months and... She trailed off, not needing to finish the sentence. They both knew where that path led, had seen enough statistics, heard enough stories to know that escalation was inevitable. That violence that goes unchecked doesn't decrease, it intensifies. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have survived something terrible together, who have seen each other at their worst and loved each other anyway. The truth doesn't care about your age, Amara thought, watching her mother across the table, seeing the strength in her now, the resilience that had been built through suffering and choosing. Every day to heal. It doesn't care about your size. It doesn't care if you're scared or shaking or standing in a church full of people who want you to be quiet, who want you to be good, who want you to maintain their comfort even at the cost of someone's safety. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it, to hold it up for everyone to see, to refuse to let it be buried under politeness and propriety, and the social contracts that protect abusers more often than victims. And on that day in that church, a 12-year-old girl named Amara had decided that someone would be her. Years later, Amara would give talks sometimes, at schools and community centers and conferences about her experience. She never made herself the hero of the story. She talked about her mother's courage in choosing to testify, in choosing to heal, in choosing to rebuild. She talked about Detective Cole's dedication, about Dr. Mbane's skill, about the systems that worked and the ones that failed. But she always ended with the same message, looking out at audiences full of people who needed to hear it, who needed permission to speak, who needed to know their voice mattered. If you've ever felt small, she would say, her voice steady and strong, carrying conviction earned through experience. If you've ever felt powerless, if you've ever watched someone you love suffer in silence and wondered if your voice even matters, I need you to hear this. It does, it always has. Your voice matters, your truth matters, your courage matters. And sometimes it's the only thing that can save a life. She would pause, letting the words sink in, watching faces in the audience, seeing recognition, seeing fear, seeing hope. Don't wait for someone else to speak up. Don't wait for an adult to notice. Don't wait for the perfect moment or the perfect words, because the people who need saving, they can't wait. They're losing pieces of themselves every day, every hour, every moment they stay in situations that are destroying them. And the people who need stopping, they're counting on your silence. They're counting on you to be polite, to be quiet, to mind your own business, to value social comfort over someone's safety. Don't give them that gift. Don't give them your silence. Use your voice. She thought about Marcus sometimes, locked away in a cell somewhere, his 15 years slowly passing, each day exactly like the one before. She didn't hate him anymore. Hate took energy she needed for better things. Energy she poured into cases and advocacy and building a world where fewer women ended up in situations like her mother's. But she remembered him as a lesson, a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters, that danger doesn't always announce itself with warning signs, that evil often wears a charming smile and speaks in reasonable tones and looks, from the outside, like love. She thought about all the women who'd come forward after her mother, the ones who'd been waiting for someone to break the silence, to prove that speaking up was possible, that justice could happen. She thought about the ones who hadn't come forward yet, who were still trapped in their own versions of that church, waiting for someone to see them, to help them, to give them a way out. And she kept fighting. In courtrooms and conference rooms, in legislation and litigation, in policy and practice, she kept fighting. Because that 12-year-old girl who stood up in a church had learned something that she carried into every case, every trial, every moment when it would have been easier to look away. Easier to accept the status quo, easier to let injustice continue because fighting it was hard. Silence protects the wrong people, and sometimes the smallest voice is the one that changes everything. Sometimes it's the voice that saves a life, that breaks a cycle, that creates ripples spreading outward in ways you can't predict, touching people you'll never meet, changing futures you'll never see. Sometimes it's the voice that makes someone else realize they can speak too, that gives them permission, that shows them what courage looks like in its most raw and uncomfortable form. And that voice doesn't have to be loud, it doesn't have to be eloquent, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be true. It just has to be brave enough to say the thing everyone else is thinking but won't voice, to name the reality everyone else is ignoring, to refuse to participate in the collective delusion that everything is fine when it clearly, obviously, devastatingly isn't. That day in the church, Amara's voice was shaking. Her hands were trembling, she was terrified, but she spoke anyway. And in speaking, she saved not just her mother, but herself, but potentially countless others who would never know her name, but would benefit from the precedent she set, from the courage she modeled, from the truth she refused to bury. So if you're standing in your own church right now, metaphorically or literally, if you're watching someone you love walk toward disaster, if you're the only one who sees the truth, remember Amara. Remember that 12-year-old girl who decided that love meant truth even when truth was hard. That protection sometimes meant disruption. That saving someone might mean temporarily hurting them. Might mean being misunderstood. Might mean sacrificing your own comfort for their safety. Your voice matters. It has always mattered. And it might be the only thing standing between someone you love and a tragedy you can prevent. Speak.